For those who don't know my role, I've got the Invasive Plants Program Manager Coordinator role with ACT Parks and Conservation and the Directorate, which is Environmental Planning and Sustainable Development. And my role is to prioritise and coordinate basic plant control and other weed control work across ACT public land and secure budgets for that work and training and capacity building staff and technical advice. And I'll just give you a bit of an overview of the team we have. We're quite lucky in ACT because we've got a good team and good budget.
So you can see that's sort of the team that does the work in the ACT. It's staff, contractors, volunteers. In the coordination role, it's myself, and I now have a ranger working with me who's a specialist in invasive species work, Harley Baker. He's really good. He works with the rangers and the volunteers and contractors on technical issues with projects and building their capacity to do work. And as you can see, it's a big program to coordinate because there's about 26 odd staff that are involved across Parks and Conservation and City Services. City Services is the new name for the, they're the part of Transport Canberra and City Services that manage urban land. And then we've got, about 16 or so contractor companies with all their staff and lots of volunteer groups as well. So there's quite a lot, keeps me busy. And as I said, we're lucky in the ACT because we have good budgets for us, the region we are like. So we're, I guess, like a region in New South Wales, and I've been to a few of the different coordinating committee meetings that we have in New South Wales, like the Southeast New South Wales Weeds Committee, and we're fortunate with the resourcing we have as a region. So you can see the budget over time, and then the budget this financial year is about $2.7 million for control work, technical support, and equipment, which is quite a large budget for the region we are. Other regions so we do a lot of work. And to give you an overview of the work we do, I'll just jump straight to our mapping system. So one reason we do have a very good budget is because we managed to win over Treasury and Finance with our mapping system, which allowed us to show where we do our control work and show improvements over time. And, we could do this in graphical form and bar charts. And that's exactly what the economists and accountants like in those areas because they want accountability. And so we're really lucky we went down that path of having a mapping system for the whole of ACT public land that nearly everyone is on, and we can justify the public expenditure and show improvements over time. And this is all the control work on public land so far this financial year. So it's a huge amount. Every coloured little line and polygon on that map is some kind of control work. Black lines and polygons or shapes indicates African lovegrass control. The pink represents blackberry control. The brown represents serrated tussock. The bright green represents everything from nodding thistle to fireweed to other herbaceous weeds. All our contractors have to map on this. It's a contract requirement. So we get all our contractor work mapped. Most of the staff remember to map. Not all the volunteers do because not all of them have access to decent smartphones. You need to be running a decent smartphone to use the apps that we use that collects this information. And the apps are called Collector and Field Maps. And we know from some of the volunteers that haven't had very good smartphones that it's a bit of a pain for them to use this mapping system. So we try when there's money around to get them access to good devices to map. And it tells us a lot. And I'll do a little tour in a second through the Murrumbidgee to show you all the control work that's happened this financial year. But I first thought it would be a good idea to talk about how do we prioritise our work, because that's important. Because with a budget like we have, it's really important we don't miss opportunities and that we get a good outcome for both the environment and also for accountability with the taxpayer. So in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a real push on new research in management of invasive species, and invasive species ecology has really developed as a discipline. So if you follow the literature, there's just so many more researchers doing work in this field, and they've come up with lots of new concepts which helps land managers like ourselves. And one of the concepts is integrated prioritization, where it's basically species, sites, and pathways is what you look at to determine which projects have our priority for funding, because clearly we don't have the resources to manage all our invasive plant species, let alone all the other weed species in degraded areas. So we need to make sure we're managing the highest risk threats and the threats that have got the best chance of being reduced. So integrated prioritization looks at the standard weed risk of a particular species. And you might use the New South Wales weed risk management system for that if you've got the information. And systems like that show, species like African lovegrass or blackberry are in the high or very high risk category. But what's important also is the sites. What are the sites at most risk in the most immediate term? And that's what this, I guess this chart here is on the side is, it's getting you to focus on the sites at most risk in the immediate term and the probability that you'll be able to actually do something about it, because that's the sites where you should put your effort. So as an example, you might want to be tackling a degraded site for revegetation, and that involves controlling a lot of weed species to allow the revegetation to establish. But nearby, there might be a bit of remnant vegetation that's under threat from encroaching African lovegrass. And if the infestation is only in its early stages, you've got a good chance of controlling it. So they call it biodiversity triage, would push you into invasive plant management is critical, immediate, and targeted, and that's where you should put your resources. And then if you've got resources left over, deal with your restoration site. And then the most other important part of this, particularly with these really highly invasive species, is the pathways of spread. And anyone who lives in urban Canberra will see that with the way African lovegrass and Chilean needlegrass spread from the urban area through corridors into the reserves, through entrances. And we've been working hard with the rangers to get those sites regularly checked, because that's the pathway that these species will get into those reserves. And in terms of creeks and catchments and the Murrumbidgee itself, well, that's the ultimate pathway of spread, isn't it? Because waterways are by their nature disturbed areas, because they get the periodic flooding and dry conditions, which gives opportunities for invasive plants to spread. And so that's on another level altogether, which I'll talk about when we look at the mapping. So next I wanted to quickly talk about was just a bit about weed risk. So in that integrated prioritization, we talked about weed risk. And this is how we go through the process. So if we have something that's a high risk, we use, has everyone seen the invasion curve, which just shows the spread of a species as it establishes a non-native species and then spreads. The invasion curve, says in the early stages, you can try for eradication, if not containment. And then if it's become widespread, like African lovegrass, you just do protection of assets that are under threat. That's what this is talking about. but it's also saying we don't only manage those species, but we manage lower and medium risk species, particularly when there's some kind of local site impact, and that's what that's saying. So say if you've got a revegetation site that's dominated by broadleaf weeds that are lower risk because they're not really invasive, because they mainly are in disturbed areas, you still have to manage them, because if you've got a revegetation site where you're trying to get understory plants in, you won't get them in unless you manage those herbaceous weeds. So just going to point that out. And then this link I'll provide to anyone that wants to see afterwards, because it's got some great resources. I'll just show you briefly this resource. It talks about weed risk assessment in general, but it's got links to some work that Dr. Paul Downey did for us on weed risk assessments in the ACT on a whole range of species, and there's a link to it there. And then because we don't have all the species we manage properly risk assessed, there's all these other resources available to help land managers make decisions on whether they should be putting effort into managing particular species. So now I'm going to jump straight to this thing here is what they call a story map. It's just an online report, which is the 5-year plan for invasive plant control in the ACT. And that's publicly available. And then all the different chapters of it, there's links to all those resources. It's basically got all the references as well. For anyone that really wants to get into the scientific literature, this is what I was mentioning before, there's lots of new research that's really interesting. One of the areas that's taking off is trying to understand plant soil feedbacks. And that's that paper there, soil biota and non-native plant invasions, because then it's the key to managing species. And in the future, I'm pretty sure we'll be doing much more work in that area. That's manipulation of mycorrhizal fungi, and there's already some of this work going on when people are trying to tie up nitrogen in the soil when they're doing revegetation work. But that's quite interesting. So there's a lot of information in there that you can get access to. And there's a lot about different control measures too, such as you can see, that's the detection dog there, which we have been using for detecting alligator weed, and some other fancy new techniques such as environmental DNA testing and LAMP DNA testing. So I'll jump straight to this, which is more interesting. So with our mapping, we're able to track our control work very well. And this chart from the operations dashboard shows the new and emerging species we're now managing in the ACT, some which I thought 10 years ago would never be managing, because I thought the climate in this part of the world wouldn't allow these species to become a management problem, but they are, such as Madeira Vine. You can see at the bottom here, we've got these sort of thresholds, and the green zone is where we think local eradication is still a possibility for us. Orange zone is unlikely, red zone is highly unlikely. And it's based on, again, this is based on some research done in both Australia and New Zealand on densities and areas of a non-native plant species. And when it crosses certain thresholds for different species, you basically have to admit that you can't locally eradicate something anymore, and you're moving into possibly containment or just managing impacts, asset protection. So you can see for fireweed in the ACT, where we are now well and truly out of the being able to locally eradicate it. And similarly with alligator weed, which is of interest to all us here, because there's implications for the Murrumbidgee, because we used to only have very contained small infestations in a few ponds and Lake Ginninderra. Now it's pretty well out of control on Lake Billy Griffin, and it's gone downstream of Lake Ginninderra Dam. So, and then in terms of other aquatics that are on that list, in the new and emerging, yellow flag iris. I never thought we'd be managing that, but that's an emerging problem for Googong Dam. It's spread from some farm dams upstream, and at first it then appeared in one of the dams near Tin Hut, and then we did a bit of a search and found it all establishing all around the edge of the Googong Reservoir area. We're on top of that at the moment. It's still in the, we can likely eradicate it. Part of this, one of the factors that goes into the equation on this is how quickly the plant can reproduce and how often it does in the growing season. So that's why things like fireweed and alligator weed, once they get to a certain level, there's no chance you'll be able to eradicate them. And then down the bottom, one of interest that Neville has probably been involved in, frogbit. Frogbit has, it started turning up in the ACT. Hasn't been found in any waterways yet. It's been found in, I think, 3 urban sort of backyard ponds, and people heard about the publicity that New South Wales Department of Primary Industry did on frogbit, trying to chase down illegal sales because it was being sold online. And these people have said, oh, I've got some. And then we recently had a report near the ANU as well of plants in a pond there. And unfortunately at that site, they said that people had been coming there and collecting it. So I got a funny feeling frogbit's going to be a species we'll be managing more in the environment in the future. So if any of you haven't used New South Wales WeedWise, I really recommend it. It's a great resource, and you can get it on your phone or iPad as well. So it's from South America. It's a very attractive plant. It's got little round inflated sponge-like leaves that are probably about 3 to 4 centimeters across at their maximum, but usually about 2 to 3 centimeters. It just dominates waterways when it establishes, and it becomes a pest eventually in people's ponds, and then they either give it away because they've got more to give away, or they sell it online if they're a bit of an entrepreneur, or they, unfortunately, I think what might happen is, this is how it'll get into the environment in our area, is they'll think, oh, I can just dump that in the local drain or something. Yeah, and there's another Limnobium species called sponge plant, but it's not meant to be in Australia yet. But they too look very similar. Yeah, and New South Wales Department of Primary Industry ran a Crime Stoppers campaign on this to try and get the sales offline, and they have, a lot of the sales have disappeared, which is good. So that's a bit. And I'm just seeing, there's one other aquatic there that I thought I'd raise because of our interest here in the Bidgie catchment, Sagittaria, which is also, I think one common name for that is Delta arrowhead, because it's got a sort of arrowhead shaped type leaf. There's a lookalike native native water plantain that looks a bit similar but much smaller. And Sagittaria is definitely on the increase too, and it's a weed of national significance for its ability to dominate waterways. And again, like Neville said, it's one of those ones that has probably spread initially from aquariums or pond trade, and then water birds probably spread it because the seeds easily attached to the feathers. I just thought I'd do a little tour showing the control work that we've prioritized this financial year. A lot of it's follow-up control sites from previous years, and some sites are sites where we're preparing areas for revegetation. And that usually involves having to do a lot of blackberry control and crack willow control before the rangers down at the Cotter do revegetation. But you'll see as we move along the river, you'll see the main species control change, and the control sites in the control area. It's referring to what the image is on the screen. And this all comes from the field mapping done on the smartphones with, oh yes. So that's another concept from the invasion ecology literature. I'll jump to that. Okay, so this comes from the literature as well. This is invasion pressure think of it as the probability in a set period of time for a given area of land that there's going to be non-native plants spread into that land. And it's made up of three things really. It's the biotic resistance, the natural resistance of a parcel of land to a non-native plant coming in. And some vegetation types are better at resisting than others. It's also dependent on disturbance, of course, because we know disturbance favors a lot of spread of non-native plants. And some of our worst invasive plants also first establish from disturbed areas and then build up their populations and then move into less disturbed country. And then what they call the propagule pressure, which is, they call it propagule because some plants don't just use seed for dispersal, they use fragments or other reproductive measures. And, if they're iridaceae, they might have corms or bulbs. So it's the amount of pressure from propagules. So a good way to envisage that invasion pressure, think of your local little remnant patch of bushland surrounded by a sea of lovegrass and lots of disturbance going on for that poor old block of bushland. So it's getting pressure from that. The biotic resistance is probably pretty low because it might have lost some of the beneficial fungi that kept the native vegetation in good health. And so there might be some decline in the native vegetation, so it's less able to compete with something coming in. So the biotic resistance is down. You've got the disturbance, and then you've got this huge propagule pressure of all that seed load, and it's just a law of numbers. And so on a site like that, the invasion pressure is extreme. And to get back to the chart, to the gauge, because of our mapping data, we're able to translate that research into a gauge. And red basically is, not good. But if you're controlling that, then, then hopefully next time around when you measure it, the gauges move back to amber or green. And amber and green, you can translate those to containment. So red basically means it's highly unlikely in this area, so this is blackberry control. It's highly unlikely the blackberry in that area will be able to be contained because, again, it's based on these principles of the size of the infestations, the time it's been there, the amount of seed in the seed bank, and the amount of untreated blackberry infestations. Orange translates to, well, possibly you might be able to contain it. And then green means, yeah, it's highly likely you'll be able to contain it. And so it's a bit of a measure for us to see the condition of areas of the landscape and also to see improvement over time, because when you look over time, you can see changes. And so it's averaging it for all the species it sees on the screen. So if you pick on one particular species, it'll change. So for blackberry itself, maybe it's worse on average. So it's driving that measure at the moment. So that's the type of thing we can do. But as we move along the catchment, we get to, say, Tharwa. You can see there are, even though African lovegrass is out of control on the river itself, as we know, there's always remnant patches of woodland and grassland that haven't been invaded yet. And that's one reason we do a lot of roadside control to stop it spreading into areas where it hasn't got into yet. And that reduces the invasion pressure on those blocks of land. And you'll see down at the bottom part of the screen, quite a lot of black there, indicating African lovegrass control. And that's to stop spread into Namadgi National Park there. And you'll see on the side there, that's quite interesting. So if we pop this up, and it shows the species, these are the species on that view of the Murrumbidgee around the Athawa of what have been managed. And I just noticed, I mean, African lovegrass, well, that's a no-brainer. Why we manage it and why it's a top one there, and things like Ceratotussock and blackberry. But notice further down, a bit of fireweed has popped up in that landscape. So that gives, that explains why in that original chart I showed you, why we say it's not possible to eradicate it anymore in the ACT. It's popping up in places where we just never had it before. And that's just the nature of an invasive plant spreading. But notice Spanish lavender, that's the topped lavender, and clockweed. So clockweed used to be in the Gaura genus. It's now moved into a different genus. It's a very popular garden plant. Some people also call it butterfly bush, whereas butterfly bush is the proper common name. That's the common name that should be assigned to buddleia, which is a shrub. But if we use the common names we use on this, if you do start looking at our data, are the ones that Fiona Richardson and her fellow authors wrote for the common names in Weeds of the Southeast, which is a big green book. So we use the common name, the first common name that she lists for a plant, so that we're trying to standardize, at least in the ACT, with her book. So that's interesting about clockweed popping up. I don't know if it'll just stay in disturbed areas or whether it'll move into less disturbed. There's been no real risk assessment done on it. And you get a bit of a hint from what people like Fiona Richardson writes in her book. She might just say only found in wasteland or disturbed areas, but sometimes she says occasionally in bushland, usually gives you an indication that it could become invasive. So as we move along and we get to the urban area, then things, of course, start getting very busy because we've got all these Murrumbidgee River Corridor nature reserves with a lot of pressure on them from a range of invasive plant species. And Tim and Michael know all about this because they used to work in some of these areas. So again, no surprise we see African lovegrass there because there's just so much in the urban landscape, but we do have to manage it. Otherwise, these reserves will just end up with understories of African lovegrass. And you can see that invasion pressure gauge stays high for natural reasons in these urban reserves. The pressure is very high because of the propagal pressure, the seed pressure on coming into the reserves. If you run this map down into the Namadgi, that gauge is often in the green zone or just in the amber zone, which shows you the difference. So we'll just keep going because there's some interesting things that pop up. I'll just jump through a bit to here. Now, so you can see we're doing we've done a lot of blackberry work on the Murrumbidgee, this part, closer to the northern parts of the ACT. And some of that is to protect remnant vegetation. Other areas, it's to get areas ready for revegetation because the Cotter Depot ACT Parks has over many years done a lot of revegetation along the Murrumbidgee and the adjoining creeks that run into it. And a lot of it's been very successful, even during the drought. And so some of those areas have been controlled, ready for some revegetation work. And then we've got some emerging problems in this area. And one in particular, which Michael probably worked on in the past, and that's serrated tussock. And that's, you'll see, if we zoom in, it's all that area there. This is Woodstock Nature Reserve. And the problem here is this is a classic thing with invasive plant species, is we're doing a good job here, keeping the density down below a level that impacts on the native understory. So I'm quite happy with what's going on there. You can see in the invasion pressure gauge. It used to be, if I pulled up the dashboard from, say, 3 years ago, that would be in the amber to red. So you can get things going in the right direction. The only problem is upwind in New South Wales, there's a huge infestation of serrated tussock, and the landholder doesn't have the, I think, the capacity to do the work because of the cost. And there's ongoing sort of negotiations with them and the local control authority to try and get some work done, because we'll never really get on top of this if we constantly have that seed load blowing in. When I start talking about these things, some people go, why does Steve jump in and out of talking about invasive plants and weeds and environmental weeds? Well, it is important because the terminology matters. And this is the sort of terminology that's developed in this field. And you'll see in the latest literature in this field, they usually talk about invasive species, invasive plants. And the reason they do that is there's a scientific definition for it. And for those of you that can see, there's on this chart, there's in the middle, it says invasive plants, and it's got these two definitions here. The one at the top is the one from the scientific literature. And it's, to summarize, it's basically saying invasive plants are naturalized plants that produce numerous reproductive offspring in areas distant from their parent plants. And the reason that's important for us as land managers is that indicates risk to the environment, because it's one thing to have a weed species that can establish in a disturbed area. It's another thing for that species to be able to disperse reproductive offspring into relatively undisturbed areas and establish another naturalized population. And that for us is landscape risk, and that's where the big damage can occur in our environment. And that's why the priority is invasive plants first, other weeds second. And like I said in that chart at the beginning, you still have to manage the other weeds, because if you want to restore areas, they're not going to magically disappear, you know. You need to manage those as well. But that's reason in the literature they use that term invasive plants. And the IUCN has simplified it. The IUCN's the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and they sort of set standard definitions as well. They're a bit more pragmatic and a bit less wordy, and they just basically say invasive plants are non-native plants. By that non-native, they mean non-Indigenous, because as we know, Western Australian bluebell creeper is a problem here. Are non-native plants whose introduction and or spread threaten biodiversity. And that's just a simpler way of saying what that scientific definition is saying, that invasive process is a threat to biodiversity. And weeds is sort of, invasive plants are weeds, but not all weeds are invasive plants, because weeds are just things we need to manage because they're growing where we don't want them at the moment. And they could be having some kind of impact, whether it's environmental or economic or social. And then a term that, for those of you who've been involved in this work as long as I have, we used to distinguish between weeds and environmental weeds. the literature now seems to be distinguishing between weeds and invasive plants. Yeah, so that's why we use that language now. I just thought I'd mention that. I'll just jump right back to this. So these links, they're all publicly available. So any area that you're particularly interested in, you'll just be able to jump on, have a look, see what work's being done. And if you want to be involved in mapping with this system, even if you're not doing control work, we have another map to map not treated infestations of, and we really are after anyone who spots any high risk species to be mapped, because we want to make sure we've got all our priorities correct, as I was saying at the beginning. Just to show you this, also, if you do jump on and have a look at this, because there's nothing on telly, it shows you things like monthly control, and you can see, where the big peaks are in control work during the financial year. And then of interest too is, I find this is fascinating, daily control. You can see when you're managing weeds, it's a year-round thing. I mean, you can see that. And even over winter, as we know, there's management of some woody weeds, pine wildings, the cool season invaders like serrated tussock and Chilean needlegrass. And you can also see who does the control work. So we're part of this. The ACT government's got a really open data policy, which is really good because not all governments do. And the ACT data plan basically says for any data that's not confidential, we should make it available. So while we don't say things about how much money that these different contractors have made, or we list who's done the work. And that lists on your computer, you'll be able to hover over and see different contractors and different, you'll also see volunteers appear for different areas. In this chart here, I think some of those lines which don't have a name next to it have got park care volunteer or land care volunteer. And it's just because of the screen view, you're losing that image, but if you hover over it, it sort of appears with a name. And then park staff sit somewhere halfway down. And place management deacon, that's city services doing their work. So you'll access it all through the story map, which is the operations plan, the 5-year plan. You'll see, you'll get this link. And then if you want to get to the mapping to see the mapping of all the work that's been done over the years, just jump straight to find, map, manage. And it tells you why we map. And then we've got 4 years of different operations dashboards to look at. And you can put those up. If you've got 2 screens, you can put them up side by side and see improvements or otherwise in areas of interest. And I'll just finish on one thing. And this has always been a thing I've always told people. And I'm not sure who gave me this quote, but I've heard it at a few places. I've heard it actually at some of the conferences that I go to Neville with, the weeds conferences. I think someone in New South Wales DPI once said, it might have been Dr. Stephen Johnson, if you don't map it, you can't manage it. And that's so important in this line of work, because people move on and then no one knows where they were working. And then we don't know if we're getting improvements if we're not mapping over time. Yeah, thank you.